Hi guys, my name's Barry and welcome back to the channel. Requels, it's still a relatively new term in the horror genre or any genre because there's not that many requels out there. Before we had reboots and before that we had remakes. So it's almost like they've tried to invent a new way of rebooting or remaking something without actually saying it's a remake or a reboot, because those movies tend not to make too much money at the box office these days. So if you create a new term like requel, I think it maybe will do a little bit better at the box office for a number of years until we have to create something else. So in this video, I'm going to be ranking 6 requels, and it's 6 horror requels I will be ranking. Now there is a few rules behind it because again, requel is still a new term, so there might be movies on this list that you don't consider a requel, or there might be movies that I've left off the list that I don't consider a requel but maybe you do. Now as the term is still relatively new, I'm going to go through some rules of what I consider a requel, and it's basically almost like what Mindy mentions in Scream 5 and Scream 6, and that is a requel is something that is a sequel to the original movie that not ignores fully its sequels, but it kind of disregards a lot of things and brings back maybe legacy characters, etc. That's roundabout what I would call a requel. Now what I wouldn't call a requel is a movie like Evil Dead from 2013. That's more of a reboot because it is still a sequel in that universe of the Evil Dead franchise, so I wouldn't consider that to be a requel. Also, to get the elephant out of the room, I might as well mention Friday the 13th from 2009, a movie that maybe unintentionally created the requel back in 2009, but nobody had a name for it. But the reason I wouldn't consider this movie a requel is because it's more of a remake slash reboot. It came out round about the remake phase when you had movies like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, etc. But I think what sets Friday the 13th off differently is it's not a direct remake of the original, because Jason Voorhees was just a child in it and Pamela Voorhees was the killer, and I think that's why this seems a little bit strange, because you can't really do a remake of Friday the 13th with Pamela Voorhees. It just wouldn't work. The main protagonist is Jason Voorhees, so if you're remaking Friday the 13th, what they had to do was bring in some elements of the first few movies, so it's not directly a requel in the terms that I consider it, because yes, it's ignoring movies in the franchise, but it's ignoring most movies in the franchise and squashing together the first 4 movies, I would say. So unintentionally it could be considered a requel, but I think it's still disguised as a remake because of the things that they do and the era that it came out. So with all that being said guys, let's get into the top 6. And at number 6 is Wrong Turn. Now you could consider this one not even a requel, but the reason I'm putting this as a requel is because in the movie they don't mention that the events of Wrong Turn didn't happen, but at the same time you could look at this movie as being a movie that just uses the name Wrong Turn to get bums on seats, and that's generally what they've done, to be honest. But it doesn't rule out the events of part 1, but it also doesn't rule out the events of part 2 onwards either. But the reason I wanted to put this on the list is because when they made this movie, it looks like they had the intention of continuing on the series from that point. The reason it is last though is because I think this movie would have been better on its own as a movie with a name other than Wrong Turn. It was an okay film, but if you're putting it into the Wrong Turn franchise, it's something that it just kind of lacked that crazy looking cannibalistic element. I know we had the cannibals in the movie, but they didn't really seem threatening. They didn't look threatening either. They just looked like people, and they were people at the end of the day, but they just looked like they weren't those typical hillbilly style deformed cannibals that we wanted to see, that we saw in the original movie. So although I felt like this was a requel in the Wrong Turn franchise, I think it could have been a little bit better. And at number 5 is Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now this film was probably 4 years in the making. Ever since the success of Halloween from 2018, they thought, let's get Texas Chainsaw Massacre back up and running just like they did with Halloween, and it took them 4 years to bring this movie out, and it eventually came out on Netflix at the beginning of 2022. And what this movie suffers from is it copies almost all of the elements from Halloween from 2018. It almost feels like it can't stand on its own 2 feet without the beat by beat elements from what we got in Halloween. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, is a flawless movie. It's a fantastic film. When I say flawless, it does have its flaws, but for back in the day, it was flawless. So it should be able to stand on its own 2 feet without having to rely on movies like Halloween to copy from. Yes, it is a requel, and yes, it does take elements from Halloween, but it should have done its own thing. Bringing back Sally, I don't think was the best option because of what they've done with Halloween. Maybe they should have done something different, but still done a requel at the same time. But because it just felt like a Halloween ripoff, I just didn't like the film, and so for that, it's low on this list. And then number 4 is Hellraiser. Now this one I actually really did like, and it is similar to Wrong Turn because it doesn't really mention anything that happens in any of the Hellraiser films, and it doesn't mention anything about Hellraiser 1, I don't remember anyway, but the director and the creators behind this Hellraiser movie did confirm it is a sequel to the first film, therefore it is a requel. But the Hellraiser franchise isn't a franchise I was deeply in love with, and in fact I only watched some of the movies for the first time last year in the lead up to this newest movie, so I was pleasantly surprised that after all the dire junk that I got to see in the lead up to this film, this was a refreshing change. It was a change in direction as well from what I saw in all of the Hellraiser movies that I saw before. So what they done well was not only did they do a sequel to the first film, they ignored a lot of the elements of the first film, which means they didn't rely on anything that we saw in the original Hellraiser movie. It stood on its own 2 feet. No, it wasn't perfect, and yes, they did change things that maybe I would have preferred that they didn't change, but at the end of the day, this movie was quite fresh, it was quite gruesome, and it had its own unique story, and it changed some of the elements for the better as well. So yeah, Hellraiser was a pretty decent film. And number 3 is Candyman. Now this film, if you've only seen it once, maybe you would think, nah, this isn't a good film. And I genuinely didn't think this was a great film. I thought it was good, I thought it was just okay when I first seen it, but I did watch it again after rewatching the original movie, and I think there's more to this film than meets the eye. I think you need to see this film a couple of times to really get into the lore of Candyman. Yes, it is absolutely different to the original film, and the first movie is the superior movie, but this, it acts more as a sequel than it does a requel, but because it is called Candyman and they're really trying to reboot what is of this series, is it a series, is it a franchise, I just don't know, because there only is really 2 movies in this requel franchise, ignoring the sequels that we got earlier. But I think if you're going to reboot or do a requel to something like Candyman, rewatching this film again, I think, do you know what, this is really good. Bringing back the original Candyman, albeit just for a small scene, was a good idea. Bringing back a character from the first film was a good idea. That bridged the gap and bridged the stories between the first movie and the second film. Not much has changed in terms of the outlook of where they're filming this movie. Not much has changed in terms of the storyline and the bleak realism of what is happening around the US today, as well as back in the early 90s. So not much has changed in that aspect, and I know that some people have got a problem with seeing that today. Their problems with it, I think, is a little heavy-handed. I think if you really just strip it back and look at it as a Candyman film or a requel to Candyman, you should appreciate it more. I think the acting in this one was more superior than the first one, unfortunately, but there's something about the original that's just, you know, so nostalgic for me. The score, the mood, the atmosphere, everything about it was a lot better, but at the same time, you're not going to be able to do much better than what you got in the original film. But Candyman on its own still stands on its own 2 feet. And at number 2 is Scream. Now I know that we've got Scream 6 and we're probably going to get Scream 7, but this ranking is only for Scream from 2022. We're going to have to ignore the events after that because this is just a requel ranking. And what I love about this one is you're bringing back the original legacy characters, all of them. And for this instance, you've got Gail, Dewey, and you've also got Sidney Prescott. And not only are they bringing them back, it's not just for cameo roles, it's not just for nostalgic factors, you're bringing them back full on, especially Dewey. You know, I love Dewey in the original trilogy, even in the fourth one as well. And he was a character that I didn't want just to see come in and be a throwaway character. And yes, obviously he died in Scream 5, but he wasn't a throwaway character. He was given his moments, he was given his parts of redemption as well up until his death. That's why his death, although I didn't really want him to die. It's still a justifiable death because he'd done what he needed to do. The only problem I had with it is who killed him behind the mask. That's the big problem. But at the same time, Scream had all the beats of the original trilogy. I still think it's a little bit better than Scream 4, therefore I think they're improving with the franchise from the slump that they had before with Scream 4. So if you're going to be improving a franchise, I'm all for it. Obviously Scream 6 was nowhere near as good as Scream 5, but at the same time they can still improve on it. But Scream 5 itself was a massive improvement on Scream 4. And then number 1 is Halloween from 2018. And similar to Scream, we're not going to be looking at it from a standpoint with Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends in the frame. It's just Halloween on its own from 2018. Now, the storyline, looking back on the storyline after 5 years, would I like to have seen it going in a different direction? Yes. Would I like them to be siblings again? Yes, but back in 2018 I didn't mind it because it was fresh, it was new, it was something different than what we got before. Looking back on it, I do feel that movies like Halloween H2O is a lot better than 2018 because of the storyline and the arc that Laurie Strode had. But when you're comparing this as a requel, you have to look at the main points. Is it a cohesive sequel to the original movie that ignores all the previous films in the franchise? 100%, absolutely. Does it have previous characters in it? Yes. Does it build on that? Absolutely. You've got John Carpenter coming back, you've got the score coming back. Everything felt like it was back to the original roots, and that's what you really want if you're going to be doing a direct sequel to the original film, ignoring all the previous films in the series. Unfortunately, it's not the second best film in the franchise, which would cement this as being the all-time best requel of all time. So no matter what comes out after, this would always be number 1. But because it has imperfections in it, I don't think Halloween will remain number 1 in my requel rankings forever, because there are other requels that probably will come out in the future that I'll maybe discuss in the future that will take it off number 1. But for the meantime, there's nothing that can take this from number 1 at the moment when you consider all the requels that are out there just now. So Halloween, number 1. So that's my top 6 requels that we have so far, guys. Like I said, not every movie is going to be included in this that you think might be a requel, and maybe there's a movie out there that I've completely forgotten about that is a requel and it does conform to the rules of a requel. And if there is, leave that down below. I didn't leave it off intentionally, I just completely forgot about it. But these are the 6 modern horror films that I would consider requels. Leave your list down below, guys. If you've only got the same 6 as me, leave that list down below. If there is other movies you would consider a requel, then leave that down below as well and we can discuss it. Nobody's wrong in this because, like I said, requel is a new term. Just like remake was a new term at some point and reboot was a new term at some point. Some people consider movies a reboot or a remake or even a requel these days. It is confusing, but if we can all have a good opinion on it and not shout at each other because nobody's wrong, that would be perfect. But as always, guys, thanks a lot for watching, thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.
I'll be right back.
What are you waiting for, huh?
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Ever played in the cat?
Someone's in the back seat!